Welcome to Preaching Unpacked. I'm Randall Parton, the senior pastor here at St. John's United Methodist Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And I'm Tiffany Hollums, the associate pastor here.
During Preaching Unpacked, Tiffany and I have a conversation about last Sunday's sermon, about some takeaways we hope that folks got from the sermon, whether they were with us in the room or watched us online or watched us later in the week. And we talk about some of the rabbits that we didn't chase in the sermon, some of the topics or ideas or themes or questions that got left on the cutting room floor, pick up some theological issues along the way, topics, questions that get raised, and look ahead to next week's sermon. And we typically start with a prayer, so let's open with prayer this time as well. O God, you have prepared for those who love you such good things as surpass our understanding. Pour into our hearts such love towards you that we, loving you in all things and above all things, may obtain your promises, which exceed all that we can desire, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. I liked that prayer.
Yeah.
That was a good one. So this last Sunday, we are still in our series on the book of Acts that we're calling Previews of Coming Attractions, and picked up the story, the book of Acts, at Acts chapter 11. And this is the story where Peter has had his vision, and he's gone to the house of Cornelius and kind of preached to Cornelius, or explained the gospel to Cornelius, and Cornelius and his whole household are baptized, and they receive the faith. And so Peter comes back to Jerusalem, and the believers in Jerusalem have some questions for Peter. Because Peter has gone to be with the Gentiles, and the Gentiles are receiving this thing, and he's got some explaining to do. Mm-hmm. And so that's from Acts chapter 11. And so I love, and it depends on the translation, but I love the question that is asked in Acts chapter 11. I'll start at verse 2, but the question is in verse 3. So when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcised believers criticized him, saying, "Why did you go to uncircumcised men and eat with them?" And then Peter began to explain it to them step by step what happened when he was in Joppa and had this vision, this dream, and was called to go to Cornelius and explain the gospel to him. Because I love the juxtaposition of they criticized him, but they asked a question. Which is just, such a wonderful kind of churchy thing to do. to couch a criticism in the form of a question, right? But what I really wanted folks to take away from this story, and I think this is kind of a thread that's coming through this whole series on the book of Acts, is how the earliest Christians were really wrestling with some of these big questions of who are we, what are we called to do. And this Sunday, the question that I think resonated was, who is this for? Is this just for us, or is this for others? And if it is for others, then what does that mean?
Yes.
How do we respond to that? What do we do with that information? And so for me, that was kind of the core question of the sermon, is kind of pinning this question of who is this for? And then just sort of acknowledging in our own history in the United Methodist Church, and just sort of throughout history, this has been a recurring question for the church, for believers. Who is this for? Who's included? Who's excluded? Who do we invite in? Who do we hold off? And it's an ongoing question, right? And so I shared a little bit of some of the moments of inclusivity and exclusivity in the Methodist movement with John Wesley. When I teach our Methodist history, I share that there is a tension at the center of our identity, of starting as a reform movement within the established church, that there is this kind of dissonance, this irritant, this sort of inconvenience of being embedded in something that's established and institutionalized, but also having this impulse, this kind of unsettledness with the way things are, right? And so that's hopefully one of the takeaways that folks got from the message. I did have a wonderful person at the 9:30 service share a personal story that I'll add just to that question of who is this for, this person does a lot of work with the international students at UNM, and part of his work is not to proselytize, not to say go into these gatherings and say, well, I'm a Christian, because there are different faiths that are part of the international community at the University of New Mexico, but sharing just how there is something kind of winsome about a witness that people know that he's a Christian, but doesn't treat them differently because they are not. Right. And I think that he really resonated with that this idea that this really is for everybody, and it's not for us to kind of say, oh, that I'll treat you differently because you're Muslim, or I'll treat you differently because you're Buddhist, or what have you. That there's something within us that is generous and kind and compassionate to everybody, because that's part of the witness of.
It's part of who we are.
It should be, right? Yes, and so I loved his story, because I think I wish more of our folks kind of had that insight, that yes, sharing our faith is important, but sort of how we share our faith and how we sort of offer our faith in a welcoming, kind, compassionate kind of way, as opposed to, making it an in-group, out-group kind of thing.
Yes, and I mean, it's so easy for that to happen with the in-group, out-group.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, that's like social psychology 101. I mean, it's part of our nature, I think, to want to create boundaries and barriers. And I think that's what's so compelling about the book of Acts is how the book of Acts is from the very beginning about how God sort of turns these things sideways, with the Holy Spirit coming to begin with, right? And all of a sudden these people who from all of these different places are hearing the gospel in their own language, right? And how God is sort of using this moment to say, this is where things are going from here. This is not just for you. And it's not just on you to make it for them either.
Yes.
That God is the one who's doing this work. And it's, Peter didn't voluntarily go to Cornelius's house. He had this vision and he had people come get him, So it's about kind of surrendering to what God is up to.
And I love that I found it really interesting when you were saying, that he shares this story. It's shared like 3 different times.
Right, yeah.
That, so often I think it would be helpful if we just explain to people maybe why we're feeling led to go to a certain group or be with a certain group, that was a big part of what he was explaining to them. Right.
And I love, and this is a rabbit I didn't chase, I love in the scripture text where it says how the believers were silenced, right? That they were quiet. And then immediately after that it says, and then they were praising God, right? So they went from, why did you go do this thing, to like, they were quiet, to then praise, and then saying, oh my gosh, even the Gentiles are getting this, right?
Yes.
And this is something worth celebrating. So they started with criticism and questions. Peter did his speech, and then they were quiet, and then they responded with praise. It was always that way.
Well, and I mean, I think that there's a graciousness in the fact that Peter told the story, told it again, and told it again.
Yeah.
Right. I think in old Peter fashion, I think he would have kind of been like,
oh yeah, that's a really good insight. I mean, because I think we're seeing a kind of a maturation of Peter, right? And I think some of that is probably a thread that Luke is running through this, is that it's not just that the movement is maturing, but the leaders are maturing, right?
Yes.
I mean, Saul is transformed into Paul, and he's maturing. Peter is certainly a different Peter than we saw in the Gospels. So yeah, that's an interesting insight.
It's like old Peter, I feel like would have kind of been like,
a bit of a hothead.
How dare you question, like, the Lord told me, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But no, he's like, I'll explain it again.
And I love the line there, step by step, right? Because it sort of implies that kind of patience. It's like, okay, here's what happened. It's just very kind of methodical, very calm, very
un-Peter.
And very confident, because I think that is sort of inspired by the Spirit. I mean, I think he has gotten to the point where he's had this really powerful experience, right? And he's convinced that this is of God. And so I think when you have had an experience like that, then you can have the quiet confidence to not feel threatened when somebody questions you with a criticism.
Yes.
Or criticizes you with a question. So
I just I think I told you this on Sunday. Like, I wanted to stand up and be like, and I was like, would that kind of scare you?
A little bit, probably, yeah.
No, I loved where it, like, even you said, this question comes up over and over. There's a lot of ink spilled on this, and it continues to be foundational. Is this story for us, or is this story for others? Because I think a lot of times we form our communities with the doors, with there only being doorknobs on the insides. There aren't doorknobs on the outsides.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, and I think this goes back to kind of human nature too. I think even when we're trying to be intentionally welcome and intentionally hospitable, it doesn't always land that way. That's why I asked the question, are we really being welcoming if somebody doesn't feel welcome?
Yes.
Right? And so it's not, it kind of goes back to what my friend Rebecca Simon Peter says, is that it's not that we have to treat people the way we want to be treated. We have to treat people the way they want to be treated, right?
Yes.
And so we have to do the extra effort to try and figure out, okay, what would make someone feel welcome, instead of putting out a welcome mat and saying, you're welcome.
Like, we welcomed you.
Yeah, and I think that's challenging, because that requires us to stretch a little bit, to have a little more imagination, and to be uncomfortable enough to ask the question, what could we do to be more welcoming to somebody who looks different, thinks different, acts different, than what we're used to, or what we think or act or or behave.
Well, and I think it requires you to look through a completely different lens. I mean, because you go from kind of knowing what will feel welcoming to someone, what might hook them, to viewing it from a vantage point where you really don't have any idea.
Right.
And it's a lot of what I kind of liken it to youth ministry, and the more generations I get removed from that, the more clueless I am as to what, and you have to, there's a degree that you have to make yourself a student of that to really ask, to try to understand what would feel welcoming, what would be interesting. And I really love that. Like, I find it challenging, to try to figure out, what would they really enjoy? What are the concerns that they're thinking about? What would help, them to feel welcome?
Yeah.
And part of what's so challenging about that is it's a constantly moving target.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's hard too, because it can feel like, or land as if that what we're doing now is not right, right, or wrong, or insufficient, or inadequate. I like to tell the story that when Susan and I were younger, and this was sort of when the wave of kind of coffee drinks was happening, and we were part of a visioning team for a church we were attending, and and we suggested maybe we could have a coffee bar or something like that during the fellowship hour, and have lattes and cappuccinos and that sort of thing. And I'll never forget, one of the older members of the church, she kind of snapped, and she's like, "What's wrong with our coffee?" It's like, and it wasn't a criticism at all. It's just like, there is this whole culture now of, Starbucks and, third spaces, and that, it's not about the coffee, it's about the experience and being together with people, and, and church coffee is notoriously suspicious. But it's just, I always think about that. So I always have that woman's voice in my head whenever, we're talking about being inclusive or welcoming people. It's like, well, what's wrong with, whatever, what's wrong with our worship? What's wrong with this, these sorts of things. And it's not a question of what's wrong with. It's like, what is God calling us to now? Where is God pulling us now? And that's why I love, I think I've said this before, I've not done a series on the book of Acts before. And so spending so much time in the book of Acts and just seeing this kind of recurring theme of God is at work here and doing these things, and these poor believers are just trying to find their way and being obedient to what God is calling them to do, and it's taking them all kinds of different places, and they're getting into disagreements. And Jack Newsom, who hopefully we'll have on one of these in the future, when he knew that I was preaching on Acts 11, he's like, well, I hope that you're going to tell the story that there was a time when Paul and Peter got into that, and Peter was on the wrong side of the story of this story, where Paul calls out Peter and says, you were all fine with going to the Gentiles until you weren't, and then you backed away from it. And this comes up in Galatians, right, where Paul is sort of kind of criticizing Peter for having sort of done the thing that God asked him to do, defended going to the Gentiles, but then when he got criticized to kind of back away from it, So it is this ongoing tension in the early church about, who is this for, and how do we communicate this to people who are not our people?
Right.
And it's messy, and it's, it's complicated, and it's hard. And
what does it mean that now they are our people?
Right. Yes. And we are these people. Right?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And I love just the relational component of all of it. Is that, you have Cornelius, you have Peter, you have, all of the leaders kind of coming. And I mean, it can be easy when you're talking about church and being inclusive and welcoming and, culturally relevant, to forget that such a huge part of that is the relational piece.
Yeah, and we do this together, right? Yeah. And I think that's an important part too, that we have to kind of figure this out. Especially given our dynamic right now in the United Methodist Church about inclusivity, right?
Yes.
We kind of have to figure this out together. It's not like one of us or one church can go in one direction and the others. I think this is a season where we're having to figure this out as best we can together, even if we don't always respond in the same way together. And I think that's another lesson from the book of Acts, right? Further along, where they have a council and they're like, okay, well, we're not in agreement here, and they sort of hammer out a sort of a third way, which I think is, helpful insofar as it can be helpful, but it's also not perfect either, right? So,
And just kind of looking at like the spirit of what was happening, of those, where in the Old Testament you really see, God is helping them to know what it means to be the people of God. And at times it feels like the walls are closed in very tightly.
Mm-hmm.
But that through Christ, it's like those doors are being opened.
Right. Yeah.
And what does that look like for the church? What does that ask of us as the church? And that so much of what you see, even, I think what's been so hard to watch, especially in the political divide, but in the church, is that it really, if you look at it, it really is about drawing lines of who's right, who's wrong, who's in, who's out.
Mm-hmm.
And I struggle with that because it seems to me like that wasn't what the gospel was about.
Right. Yeah. So I had this great quote from Will Willimon talking about, that if, as the church confesses, Jesus is Lord, right, then the church has this adventurous responsibility of kind of figuring out the implications of what it means to say Jesus is Lord in places, in ways that we haven't yet considered.
Yes.
Right. And he goes on to say in that but it's not just a question of following every wind of change, every sort of new trend, everything like that, but to have kind of a spirit of discernment to really kind of plumb the depths of what's happening in this present moment, right?
Where is the Spirit stirring?
Yeah, to not come up with easy answers, to not just sort of be blown by the winds of change wherever the winds of change are blowing, but to have that kind of sort of resolute fidelity to the gospel, to the proclamation that Jesus is Lord, to understanding how the Spirit is moving and where God is acting in this moment. That is, it sort of takes it to a whole other level, in a sense, to say it's not just a matter of God is leading us in all these new directions, therefore anything new is fair game,
right?
But that as the community, that we have to be so in touch with what God is doing and have such a depth to our practices and our identity to sort of reconcile that with, to say, God is doing a new thing here.
Yes.
And I kind of feel like sometimes I was just having lunch with a colleague, that's some of the struggle, I think, in established churches is we haven't always done the deep work around discernment. We haven't always considered that God might be doing something new, and really kind of tested those spirits, to use that biblical term, right?
Yes.
To sort of say, okay, well, if that's the case, and I think as anxiety has increased, as the church has sort of been moved further away from the center of public life, I think it's become harder because churches, I think, want a sort of quick solution. They want to sort of, and this goes back to the worship wars and contemporary worship and,
yes,
screens in the sanctuary and all those things that we thought, okay, if we did this, if we made this sort of technical change, if we gave into the culture in this way, then, then the culture will find us relevant again. But it's not about being culturally relevant. It's actually about following God where God is active. And maybe that means we're not at the center of public life anymore. And maybe that's okay.
Well, and I find him in myself, just even personally, of always being aware of where are those areas that feel uncomfortable, and I want to draw those lines. That one of the ways that, like, the Spirit has really moved in me is to move toward those places that feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think for me it was especially transformative for me, working in the inner city, to where I was the one that was different.
Yeah.
I think it changed the way that I look at how do you talk about inclusion, not even just, inclusion of a specific group, but just in general, and having that experience of being on the outside, but being in a position of power.
Right, yeah.
To kind of live into moving into those areas where you feel uncomfortable. And I mean, honestly, it usually comes down to being vulnerable, lack of control.
Yeah. And we're so good with that, aren't we?
I know. And it's just trying to...
Where do we sign up for vulnerability?
Trying to live into that, and I find even now, like, it's in youth ministry and talking with people about children's ministry post-pandemic, is I don't have any clue.
Well, and isn't that that part of the problem with this present moment, to talk about where God is at work now, is, if anything, one of the lessons that we learned during the pandemic is that we are vulnerable and out of control, whether we recognize it or not, whether we like it or not. And part of I think the challenge of this present moment is, as we're trying to come out of the pandemic, is the temptation to try and exert control and to sort of remove vulnerability as much as possible.
Yes.
And I think there is a certain amount of, we have to be willing to kind of relax just a little bit.
You just don't know.
And, and it's hard because, we want to put this past us and put it behind us and, recover everything that we can recover. And And I think, and I've been saying this for a while, and the post-pandemic church is not going to be the church of 3 years ago.
No.
Some things may come back, some things will be different, some things are gone forever, and something new may be there for us that we just haven't discovered yet, right? That's the sort of the adventurous task of the church in this present moment. And you're right, there is a certain amount of discomfort with that. And I think I mentioned in the sermon, I worry that we've become really comfortable.
Oh, absolutely.
We've become really complacent. Oh, there's a spider. Hello, friend. Oh, there he goes.
No, I think part of it is, I think there are some people who really, change is hard and the unknown is hard. And there's others that have had to live in that space of not knowing. And one of the things that I've found so helpful for me is to have that spirit of always, I don't understand, but I want to try to understand.
Right. Yeah.
And help me to know what that looks like.
Yeah.
And being okay of saying, I don't know, but we could find out together.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've frequently grown comfortable with saying I don't know. I'm happy to find out or happy to learn. And just sort of admitting that I don't have all the answers.
And you would think as you get older that you would know, but I feel like it's, again, I think the pandemic, I think part of what has been so anxiety producing in people is that awareness of how fragile the balance is, how fragile our lives are, how fragile the systems are that we thought were foolproof.
Yeah.
Really not.
I've thought about that a lot. We just saw Come From Away at Pope Joy last weekend, and thinking about 9/11 again. And I think for me, and this is probably a generational thing, I think 9/11 was kind of the moment where we realized, oh my gosh, everything is just a lot more fragile than we pretend it is. It's just, and I think the pandemic is, sort of another layer of that,
I think the UMC is another.
Yeah, our denomination is, and I think that there are folks that are having a hard time with that. And I think there are folks that, we've talked a little bit about this, that this is going to be a slow kind of unraveling of our denomination in some ways.
Well, and even if you look at the way the UMC is structured as connectional, it's like, you have things like the trust clause that it's like it was in there to keep us from falling apart.
Yeah.
But it makes it all the more difficult. And, even if you look at the nature of clergy, it's like there's all these safeguards that have been built in that now we're seeing, oh, wow.
Yeah. We've tried to nail everything down. Yeah.
We've methodically tried to make everything fit, but what happens when it doesn't fit?
Yeah.
And what happens if, I guess it made me wonder, like, okay, so Peter saw this vision of these things coming down on the cloud, like, what are the things that are on that sheet for us that God is like, are you going to...
Right. What are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about this? Yeah. That would have been a great sermon, Tiffany. I'm sorry I didn't ask you to preach.
And that we bring a big giant sheet down.
We could do that in the sanctuary or the Family Life Center, yeah. That would be really frightening.
I don't know. I had the kids working on something for Pentecost.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I do.
Something to look forward to.
Just kind of trying to think of worship arts, and what would be, an interesting way for them to kind of see the Spirit. But this is totally off the subject, but it was interesting thinking about the fire of the Holy Spirit living in the time that we're living in right now with the fires. And I was kind of talking with the kids about that, and I was like, wow, that's very apropos right now with wildfires everywhere, and you're talking about the fire of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
I kind of didn't know what to do with that.
A fire right now in New Mexico is not
It's not a positive thing.
No,
it's not.
It really isn't.
And so when I was asking them, so what does fire do? And they were like, it burns up people's houses. And I was like, oh, wow. So.
That'll preach.
I know.
Interesting. So one of the things that I didn't do in the sermon, talking about sort of inclusivity and exclusivity, is previous Sunday, Bishop Schnese was here, and we went out to lunch with him afterwards, and he is from the Rio Grande corridor, serves in San Antonio now, is the resident bishop there in the San Antonio area, and also we share him here in New Mexico, and he's a birder. He does bird watching, and he's gone down to the Rio Grande Nature Center here in Albuquerque a few times.
Okay.
But he shared with me the dissonance, the kind of the mind-boggling experience of going to the river here in Albuquerque and looking across the river and having his mind think that that's Mexico. Because in South Texas, when you look across the river, it's a different country.
The same river.
It's the same river. And so thinking that, that he has to sort of, his mind just sort of kind of subconsciously thinks, oh, that's the border, that's the other side, because that's what it's always been for him. And I kind of half-heartedly joked, and I said, well, there are people who live on the east side who it might as well be another country over there, because we ain't crossing the river for anything. And so I was thinking about kind of starting with that story and just talking and just asking, because I don't even know how many of our people cross the river to get here, right?
Do I cross the river to get here?
No.
Okay.
No.
I am so bad with geography. And clearly with paying attention to where I'm driving. Wow. Okay, so how many?
I don't know. I mean, I was going to actually ask for a show of hands of how many people crossed the river to get to church this morning.
Wow.
But to think about how, even something like that, which is not cultural, it's not, and it's not really a kind of a sensitive topic in some ways, because then Bishop was asking, he's like, well, why don't you go to the west side? What? And I said, well, everything I have is over here. There's nothing on the west side for me. And so our family was talking about, well, what do they have on the west side that we don't have over here? Why would we go to the west side? We've had to go to the west side for medical stuff because there's Russ Medical Center over there. Sometimes, so for some kind of medical procedure, you might need to go to the west side because that's where it's at. But for the most part, the river in Albuquerque is just a real dividing line, and it's one that we all kind of recognize, and it's not that I think there's implicit, that our side is better than their side, kind of thing. But it would have been a gentle way, I think, to kind of sort of say, we do these divisions, we do this kind of that's them, this is us all the time, and a way to talk about how for Bishop and being a third person coming in and thinking, oh, that's the border,
amazing.
And it's not the border, but it is a barrier in some ways culturally here in Albuquerque. So.
Well, even with me living in Santa Fe, and driving, when people, it was really interesting when I first started here, because everybody would be like, oh my gosh, like, you're going to be driving, and like, people were so gracious, like, you could stay overnight if you need to, and and I just was kind of like, because I grew up in the southeastern part of the state where you have to drive at least an hour to get anywhere, and even then it was 2. And if you live in some places like Dallas or something like that, you're going to drive 45 minutes to an hour to work.
That's your commute.
But it seemed like, and everybody would kind of always mention, is it La Bajada? Yeah. Like the big... It's kind of like that was the point of no return. It's kind of like it was interesting because to me, I just am like, You just drive down the road.
Yeah.
Right? But to them, and it made me wonder, like maybe back in the day, it was a treacherous drive to Santa Fe, that people are like, ooh, like...
I think it's an Albuquerque thing. I think
Is it?
Because Albuquerque is the largest metropolitan area in the state, and so many things happen here that people who live here don't have to travel very far to do all the things.
Okay.
But having lived in other parts of the state, in eastern New Mexico and southern New Mexico, you have to drive everywhere to do anything.
You do.
And so I think it is sort of a certain amount of kind of Albuquerque privilege of that, everything that you need is right here, and, and you can do it all on the east side.
Well, and I
across
always,
the river
it really
to do
made me kind of
anything.
question myself at first, because I thought,
Yeah, it's just an Albuquerque
am I
thing, think.
weird that it really doesn't seem like that big of a
Yeah.
thing to me.
Yeah, I think it's just an Albuquerque thing.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, my dad's main words of wisdom when I was growing up, when I first started driving, is he was like, anytime you see a gas station, get gas.
Oh, yes.
Because...
Yeah, living in the West, you learn that really quickly.
Yeah, you're going to be in really, really big trouble if you get, between Lovington and Vaughn and you don't have gas.
Yeah.
So that's interesting about just the barriers that we put without even realizing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and how small or how expansive your world is in ways that you don't even recognize, right? Yeah. Another rabbit I didn't chase was, and again, this depends on the translation, is the question that the disciples asked Peter, because I love it, and I said this a little bit earlier, that it's sort of a criticism disguised as a question.
Okay.
And I was going to tell a story one time about when I was younger in college. I spent a weekend with my grandmother, and my grandmother, in sort of typical grandmother fashion, sort of asked, she said, "Are you going to wear that outside?" It's a question, right? But it was really, I mean, what it should have been, please don't wear that out in public.
What was it?
So it was the 80s, and so I had like this really bright red shirt that was kind of like, it was lighter red on the top and darker red on the bottom. It was very, new wave, I guess. She did not care for it, but she didn't say she didn't care for it. She just asked the question, "Are you going to wear that?" And so that's what I imagine the disciples asking Peter, like, "Did you really eat with the Gentiles? Did you really do this? Are you really going to do this?"
That was always DG, my husband. In college, he would wear these wild things. Like he had these pants that were like that, but like. And people would say, they wouldn't even phrase it as a question to him. They were so hideous.
What are you wearing?
Why are you wearing that? That's awful. And DG's response would always be like, yes. Like it would make him want to wear it even more.
That's right.
But yeah. Oh my gosh, that's funny. So can you bring that shirt?
Oh, that shirt is so long gone, Tiffany.
That's so disappointing. I think we need a picture of that.
I may have a picture of it. I think another thing is, and I didn't talk about this in the sermon, is that there's sort of multiple conversions happening in this story, which I think is also an important lesson for the church. So Cornelius is converted.
Yes.
Right? He receives the gospel, and he and his whole family believe, and they're baptized.
And his whole family.
I
love that.
That's an important part of the story as well. Peter himself is converted to take the message to Cornelius, so he has a little bit of a conversion.
Yes.
Through this vision that he has. And in this story, the believers in Jerusalem have a conversion, right? Because
that's really cool. Because we usually only just talk about the conversion of Saul.
Right.
But
there's this ongoing kind of conversion of of others, of Peter, of the disciples, that there's this kind of this, it's all very fluid.
I love that.
It's this constant changing story about what God is up to and where the believers are, and that I think is just really, really insightful for our current age.
It is.
That we things are not settled for us. We know they're not settled for us, but what if this unsettledness is a season where God's Spirit is doing something new in the church, and our calling, our vocation is to ride that unsettledness as faithfully as we can and become who God wants us to become in the process.
And it's okay
for
that to evolve.
It's okay for us to get it wrong. It's okay for us to not know. It's okay for us to... Yeah.
I struggle with that because I find myself like always wanting to like, I'll chew on things and toss all the answers and look at all the time frames and, what would be the absolute best answer or the best solution.
Mm-hmm.
And God is like, maybe you don't have all the pieces yet.
Right.
Maybe you're going to have to walk through that.
Yeah.
And put them together as you go.
Yeah.
I don't like that.
I don't know that anybody does, but I don't know that we have much option. Right? No. So this coming Sunday, we're still in the book of Acts. We're going to move to Acts 16, which is another bit of a conversion story. This is Paul's vision of the Macedonian, right? Of the gentleman from Macedonia.
Ooh.
Calling Paul to come over to Greece, to basically leave Asia and come to Europe and preach in Europe there.
So what are you going to do with that?
I've got several rabbits that I've got lined up ready to go on that. I don't know yet, but this is also the story where Lydia, who is a dealer in purple, becomes converted, and there's an important part of that story as well. That I think Luke does. I love good writing, and I'm just sort of really adoring how Luke is just weaving the story and the kind of
amazing.
And this came up with the story of Dorcas, right? Mm-hmm. That it's almost like this kind of aside, right? All these things happening. Paul has this conversion, and then there's this little story about the invalid Aeneas, and then the story of Tabitha, who's also known as Dorcas. And that story is important, right?
Yes.
And part of it is just sort of that, there's all this big stuff happening, and yet here's something big that's happening to these people who otherwise lived ordinary lives, who, and God was at work in them as well. It's just, there's sort of multiple layers of this. And so in this story in particular, there's just a lot of threads to kind of chase down, and there may be a lot for us to talk about next week of things I didn't chase down, so.
I know, and I won't be here next
I
week.
won't be here, that's right. So
I'll be at Hogwarts.
Oh, fantastic, yes. I'm a little jealous.
Mm-hmm.
Hope you have a great time.
I know. Hogwarts and Disney.
Hogwarts and Disney, fantastic.
So
I have to imagine that you all are more excited than Gracie is.
Oh, I am so excited.
Yeah.
Yes. But Gracie is going to make me ride roller coasters, so I might not return with all of my sanity intact.
Oh, you don't do roller coasters?
I don't like roller coasters.
This is an aging thing for me. I don't enjoy them as much as I did when I was younger. So.
I've never liked
them. Yeah.
When you were wearing your red shirt.
Oh, I would have totally been all over it then. I had this moment one time though, when our kids were younger. We went to a county fair, and there was this ride, and I'm like, oh, no, that's it.
Really?
I can remember the moment. It was Fayetteville, North Carolina. I can tell you, I probably could tell you what I was wearing, and I'm like, okay, this is not for me anymore. This is just not for me anymore. I can't do it. And what's funny is we were riding with Sophie at the time, and Sophie has kind of motion sensitivity, I think, and really does not like, thrill rides. Really, really does not like thrill rides. And so now we are kind of, Eli and Susan will go off and ride,
Oh, no. I've never liked them, and DG would usually ride them with Gracie, but we kind of think he might have like the football concussive thing because he gets violently sick. And so this last time that we went, Gracie was about 7, and she wanted to ride the ride that flipped upside down, mm-hmm. which I would just rather die. Mm-hmm. And I was walking up, and I was so thrilled because I thought it said you had to be 5'2" to ride it, and Gracie wasn't yet 5'2", And so then I told them, I said, oh gosh, she can't write it. She's not 5'2". And they were like, no, it's 52 inches. And I'm like, oh, now I have to write it. And it was just awful.
Oh, it depends. For me, it depends. I could do the kind of the corkscrew ones, but I don't know that I can do the ones that, and some of it's just also just the speed for me.
No,
so.
no. No, I like challenges, but I do not like.
Okay.
No.
Interesting. All right.
So I mean, I may come back and be like, because.
You'll be recovered by then. You'll get over it really quickly.
I don't know.
Well, I hope you have a terrific time. We'll miss you. Jack Newsom is going to be with us next week to talk about this passage from Acts 16 and the conversion of Lydia and Paul, sort of getting invited to come across.
Nice.
So I'm not quite sure where I'm going to take that. But Jack will be with us, and Jack's always good for conversation along these lines. We will miss you, but hope you have a good time as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.